What was said on the hill that never reached the eyes of the world? This question cuts through the silence like a thread and already sets the tone. We are about to enter something guarded, whispered, and, at times, contested. Imagine the hill. At dusk, silhouettes silhouetted against a sky that seems to hold secrets. Imagine hushed voices, words that have been sealed and that, according to local seers and witnesses, carry a weight that transcends time. Have you ever experienced this, that feeling that there is a truth waiting to be heard, a warning or a promise that changes the way you see the world? Stay with me until the end, because what you discover now may surprise you and perhaps upset some comfortable certainties. Since the first apparitions in Medjugorje, the place's name has become synonymous with an intense encounter between the human and the sacred. Apparitions, prayers that last into the early hours of the morning, signs that some swear they saw in the sky. But within this phenomenon, the so-called 7 unrevealed messages of Medjugorje circulate, fragments that, according to reports from researchers and those who were there, were kept secret for reasons ranging from protection, discernment, and pastoral calculation. We won't take sides here. We'll listen to the voices, map out the possibilities, and understand why these messages provoke such fascination and fear. Throughout this journey, we will touch on themes that stir the heart: a call to conversion, public signs that defy reason, promises of protection for the family, and an urgent appeal for spiritual preparation. Each of these ideas appears in the narratives as an emotional, not fear, hope, mystery, and it is precisely in this mix that the power of the messages resides. Some scholars approach the subject cautiously, others with a mix of respect and urgency. And what about the witnesses? Some report profound transformations after hearing a call. Others urge prudence and silence. This tension between faith and doubt, between what is said and what remains hidden, is the driving force behind our video. If you've ever felt that shiver when you hear a story that seems small at first glance, but is gigantic on the inside, then you'll recognize the rhythm of this content. We'll tell it, carefully interpret it, and, above all, raise questions that you can answer in the comments. So I ask again, have you ever felt that a warning could change your life if you heeded it in time? Write in the comments if so. I want to read your experience. In the meantime, enjoy the images we'll show you. Silhouettes on the hill, a sunset. That seems to open a gap between the natural and the supernatural. Quick snippets that evoke the atmosphere of a closely guarded secret. By combining visionary accounts with researchers' analyses and short stories from local families. I don't promise absolute truths, rather, I promise a respectful and unsettling dive. We'll discuss prophecies that sound like warnings, signs in the sky that some swear they saw, and a repeated invitation to repentance and change. And if part of this secret was deliberately silenced out of fear, prudence, or strategy, what is the price of this silence? Who wins and who loses when a message remains hidden? Hold that question, because in the next part, we'll open the emotional map of these 7 messages and begin to unravel, one by one, what each whisper on the hill might mean for you, your family, and the community. As we continue to unravel this emotional map of the 7 messages, I want to invite you to join me on this quest, not as a distant spectator, but as part of the community that wants to understand, discern, and perhaps transform something in their own lives. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what has touched you most so far. A memory, a question, a fear, or even a sign you've noticed that no one else has. Your story matters. It's these accounts that help us see beyond theories and recognize the real effect these words whispered on the hill can have on families, communities, and hearts. If you're enjoying this dive, a like helps a lot. It's not just a number, it allows more people to find this content and be reached by these reflections. And if you want to follow the full investigation, with reports, documents, and more in-depth analyses in the next installments, subscribe to the channel. Subscribing shows us that it's worth dedicating time and care to bringing you more videos like this. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. And I believe that together we can build a space for serious and welcoming dialogue about prophecy, signs, and discernment. Also, let me know in the comments if you'd like me to include more testimonials, expert analysis, or a detailed reading of each message. This feedback will guide the next video and make the sequence more useful for you. As you write, take a moment to look back at the images of the hill. Pay attention to the little things, a gesture, a light, a silence. Hold on to that feeling, because now we'll begin to unravel the first of the 7 messages. Understanding its tone, its warning, and what it might truly mean to those who heard it that night on the hill and to you, the viewer. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Medjugorje sits on a hill that, for many, is both a physical place and a threshold between everyday life and sacred silence. It's a village in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where, according to reports, circulating for decades, apparitions have occurred that have changed lives, sparked theological debate, and created a veritable pilgrimage of restless hearts. The phenomenon of apparitions involves ordinary people who claim to have had prolonged encounters with a presence that brought messages of repentance, transformation, and urgency. It is precisely this blend of intimate experience and public repercussion that makes the subject so divisive. Some see clear signs of a spiritual calling, others call for caution, investigation, and institutional prudence. This tension between faith and critical analysis is the terrain we will now tread, with respect for the witnesses and investigative curiosity. Without demanding that you accept a hidden truth as absolute law, when we talk about Medjugorje, we're not just talking about spectacular events. We're talking about a human journey that touches on life decisions, mindsets, and routines. For some families, hearing a message was the beginning of a profound transformation, a change in habits, a return to prayer, reconciliations that seemed impossible. For others, it was a source of discomfort, doubt, and even rejection. The impact goes beyond the personal sphere and reaches entire communities. Because a prophecy, real or perceived, shakes structures, beliefs, traditions, and even religious leadership. Behind the scenes of these narratives are researchers cataloging accounts, theologians pondering authenticity, and residents who cherish simple memories, like the light that seemed different one summer. These are valuable clues for those seeking to understand the phenomenon without reducing everything to sensationalism. The language of the messages, as described by visionaries and those close to them, alternates between the intimate and the public. There are phrases that sound like personal advice, call to repentance, a request to care for one's family, and others that convey images of visible, almost cinematic signs, which some swear they saw in the sky. These variations generate multiple interpretations. Some read the messages as invitations to inner transformation, and others understand them as announcements of collective events. The truth is that this ambiguous space requires an open but also discerning mindset, because decisions based on fear or exaggeration can have real consequences. Ask yourself, what would be the necessary decisions today if a message called for a radical change in community behavior? How can we balance prudence and generosity of heart? When looking at the 7 unrevealed messages, it's helpful to imagine each one as a piece of an emotional mosaic. Some pieces seem to speak of prevention instructions for protecting the family, prayer practices, signs that would guide those who are attentive. Other pieces whisper harsher warnings that challenge social comforts, changes in order, tests of faith that test priorities. Still others, reportedly, bring promises of comfort and hope, as if to say, there is a safe path for those who choose true transformation. This interplay between warning and promise creates a complex narrative, where the impact lies not only in the words themselves, but in how these words translate into everyday actions. The witness's journey deserves to be told with care, because behind each story, there are people who have made human decisions, leaving a job to serve a community, repairing a family relationship, or simply changing their mindset in the face of mystery. These gestures, however small they may seem, constitute a kind of spiritual pedagogy that many apparition messages often provoke teaching through transformed lives. On the other hand, there are also stories of fear, of groups that have closed themselves off, of interpretations that have caused division. Understanding this contrast is understanding that the same message can bear different fruits depending on the soil in which it falls. A heart willing to listen can produce transformation. An environment closed to dialogue can amplify the risk of hardening. Let us, therefore, look closely at the reported signs, lights in the sky that some have described as not belonging to any known natural phenomenon, collective dreams that arose in nearby communities, unexpected actions by local leaders after encounters or revelations. Each of these elements makes up what some call the behind the scenes of the phenomenon, details that don't immediately make headlines but that shape the perception of those on the inside. Researchers who have spent time in Medjugorje distinguish direct accounts from those that have become legends through repetition. This distinction is essential to separate what has factual force from what has been layered with interpretation over the years. At the same time, we cannot ignore the psychological dimension. Collective phenomena have the power to shape beliefs and identities. The spirituality experienced in apparition sites often reconfigures priorities and creates supportive communities that, for many, represent practical and emotional salvation. This duality, risk and potential, is part of the great attraction and controversy. What is at stake is not only the veracity of a supernatural event, but also its concrete impact on people's lives and the decisions they make after hearing a message. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. I want you to feel the weight and subtlety of the words whispered on the hill, without rushing to label, but with attentive eyes to notice how each phrase can touch a wound, heal a relationship, or provoke a change of direction in someone's life. Think of the small actions that could be direct consequences of these messages. A family dining together again, a young person rethinking their plans, a community organizing to help the most vulnerable. Think also of the difficult decisions that may arise when the calling demands sacrifice. How do we measure the price of fidelity? When a promise of protection becomes the condition for a risky choice, Who is responsible for guiding wisely? These questions are not rhetorical. They are the essence of the human journey in the face of a truth that appears like a whisper, and it is precisely at this point that we begin to perceive the true complexity of the 7 messages, their practical implications, and their potential for transformation or division. Comment: this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic. When we consider the conflict between public and confidentiality, we enter a territory that combines responsibility, strategy, and, above all, human consequences. There are practical reasons why certain messages may have been kept out of immediate reach. Protection: protecting those who receive the message from exposure that could put them at risk or make them a target for exploitation. Discernment: leaders and experts time to verify signals, check consistency, and avoid hasty decisions. Prophetic timing: believing there is a right time for information to be made public. And decisions of authority: when bishops, theologians, or local leaders opt for pastoral prudence or a strategy they consider most appropriate for the community. These hypotheses are not mutually exclusive. They often coexist and overlap behind the scenes of history. When leaders and witnesses disagree, silence can say more than words. This phrase acts like a beacon. It indicates that silence is not just absence, but also a meaningful gesture. It can be protection, it can be calculation, it can be fear, and in all cases, it has an impact. Imagine the scene: a message speaking of public signs and collective change reaches the ears of some seers. Rumors begin to circulate, and soon the neighborhood is filled with anxious chatter. If the leadership decides to withhold the information until clarity is achieved, this avoids immediate panic, but it can also generate frustration and distrust. On the other hand, hasty disclosure can trigger impulsive decisions, displacement, and even family ruptures. Hidden truth, therefore, acts like a double-edged sword. It protects and deprives, it prevents and paralyzes. There's also an ethical dimension that's often left out of public debate. Who has the authority to decide what should be disclosed? What's the acceptable risk criterion for keeping something secret? Religious leaders might argue that revealing a message now would bring more harm than good, a legitimate argument when we consider structures of coexistence and social stability. But the opposite danger exists: turning silence into control, a tool for managing narratives or maintaining power. Therefore, history invites us to look closely at motives and methods. Total transparency is also no panacea. Responsible discernment requires time, investigation, comparison of accounts, and, above all, attentive listening to the human repercussions. From a social perspective, decisions to keep messages secret reverberate through the collective mind. Entire communities may adjust behaviors because they believe an imminent warning is imminent. This changes routines, priorities, and even local markets. Think of a village where people begin to hoard, reorganize rituals, and prioritize family gatherings. The material and emotional impact is real. On the other hand, secrecy can protect a community from hysteria or exploitation by groups seeking advantage. This balance between protection and the potential for transformation is delicate and requires pastoral sensitivity combined with intellectual clarity. For witnesses, the cost of secrecy is often personal. Those who receive the message can carry a heavy burden, the temptation to tell everything and the obligation to remain silent. This affects their emotional health, relationships, and their spiritual journey. There are reports of people who felt relief in sharing what they knew. Others kept it to themselves for years, living with anxiety and the feeling of carrying a hidden truth. This is where the human dimension of the phenomenon becomes central. It's not just about doctrine or ecclesiastical policy, but about concrete lives that change decisions, jobs, and relationships. The transformation a message provokes depends as much on its content as on the ground it lands on: the collective mindset, the local culture, and the history of trust between leaders and believers. Another layer to consider is that of prophetic timing. Some believers believe that certain revelations have a spiritual timeline. They only make sense when they align with historical events or signs. In this understanding, revealing a message too soon would detract from its effectiveness or, worse, distort the appropriate response. For those who view the world through this lens, secrecy is, therefore, a way of fulfilling a greater timing, a strategic element of the revelation itself. This generates debate among scholars: how to distinguish between legitimate prudence and unjustified delay. How to weigh the risk of revealing against the risk of concealing. In the field of research, researchers studying religious phenomena insist on procedures, documenting accounts, comparing testimonies, mapping patterns, and differentiating memory from myth. Behind the scenes, this involves interviews, records, possible psychological evaluations, and checking for synchronized events. All of this takes time. Meanwhile, the community waits, and narratives grow in the space left by silence. Human imagination, lacking clear facts, tends to fill gaps with stories. And then conspiracy theories, urban legends, and interpretations emerge that can distort the real impact of messages. The hidden truth, then risks becoming something bigger than it is or smaller, depending on who intends to exploit it. And there's the pastoral aspect. Leaders who choose to delay may do so out of responsibility, fearing that the revelation will impose demands the community isn't ready to face. Spiritual preparation is one thing, cultural shock is another. A message that calls for radical change without offering practical paths for transition can lead to ruptures. The sensitivity of a pastor, bishop, or person responsible for guiding concrete steps, training, counseling, social support is often a reason to postpone disclosure until conditions are in place for acceptance. This is a way of addressing the practical impact of the revelations. Ultimately, understanding why some messages remain hidden requires accepting that we live at a crossroads between faith, responsibility, and power. Secrecy can be protection, strategy, or error. It can be mercy or manipulation. Evaluating each hypothesis requires the courage to ask, but also the humility to recognize that we won't always have all the answers. And it is precisely this tension between what is revealed and what remains hidden that makes history pulse with human relevance. Decisions are made, mindsets change, communities transform or divide, and the consequences spread like waves. But what exactly was sealed? Comment, that makes sense to me. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic. When we consider offering a panoramic view of the 7 unrevealed messages, we should imagine a map where each point has its own emotional signature, a color that blends warning, hope, urgency, and promise. This isn't the time to claim to know everything. It's time to listen to the tone of each phrase, perceive the impact they can have on the minds of those who hear it, and understand how these words, even if partial or hidden, act as catalysts for transformation. In some narratives, the first signature that emerges is that of a warning, a call that reminds us of limits, points to imminent dangers, and aims to provoke immediate decisions. This type of message, when translated into everyday life, can mean practical changes, reviewing priorities, restructuring families, or even adjusting the way a community cares for its most vulnerable. The warning carries with it pressure. It's a spark that can ignite fear, but it can also ignite vigilance, and this is where the dynamic between risk and care begins to operate. Another recurring theme in the descriptions is the call to repentance, which has a more intimate and pedagogical tone. It's not just about tremors in the external world, it's about the listener's inner journey, reviewing behaviors, repairing relationships, choosing a new path for the mind and heart. This message often touches on the realm of personal decisions, abandoning habits that corrode relationships, prioritizing what truly matters, or opting for routines that promote healing and reconciliation. When these words reach someone willing to hear them, the potential for transformation is real. Small changes in daily attitudes that, combined, alter destinies. But this signature can also provoke resistance. Change requires renunciation, and renunciation affects people's psychological security. Therefore, the same message that heals in one context can generate conflict in another. There are also messages that present themselves as promises of protection, often addressed to families and communities. These promises emerge as a kind of practical comfort guidance that promises to protect those who set out on a path of faith and obedience. In practical terms, this can mean rituals, prayer practices, home blessings, caring for the family environment, and even recommendations on social behavior. For some, this promise acts as an anchor in the face of uncertainty. Following a prescribed path gives meaning and reduces anxiety. For others, the promise raises questions about dependence and autonomy, how much to trust in external guidance and when to maintain a critical and responsible attitude when faced with important decisions. Messages also emerge that speak of future signs, visible, public, even cinematic, in the words of those who tell them. These are the ones that most fuel the collective imagination, because they touch on what we call the spectacle of the sacred, lights in the sky, synchronized signals, events that become temporal references for an entire community. The impact of these narratives is twofold. On the one hand, they create a sense of urgency and mobilize collective action. On the other, they offer fertile ground for speculation and the formation of myths. The community, faced with a perceived sign, changes behaviors, adjusts calendars, and, not infrequently, reshapes its own history based on that event. The hidden truth here is that the sign only exists to the extent that someone recognizes it as such, and the process of recognition. It is profoundly social. Each of the 7 messages, therefore, can be seen as a piece of a larger mosaic. Some pieces are darker, bringing fear. Others emit light, generating hope. Still others vibrate with urgency, demanding immediate decisions. And all of them, together, form a narrative that touches the human journey in its multiple dimensions, from the intimate to the collective, from the psychological to the pastoral. By mapping this emotional landscape, we see how the revelations work behind the scenes. They shape mindsets, guide everyday decisions, and influence leaders and local social networks. The impact is not merely theoretical. It manifests itself in concrete gestures: a family table that comes together again, a neighbor who decides to forgive, a community that organizes support for the elderly. The journey from message to practice is made of small but decisive steps. That's also important to note that each emotional signature carries its own type of risk. Where there is fear without guidance, panic can arise. Where there is hope without criteria, disappointment can arise. Where there is urgency without practical support, pressure can hurt more than it saves. Therefore, the map of the 7 messages must always be read with a perspective that combines pastoral sensitivity, serious investigation, and psychological care. Researchers and theologians who study these accounts remind us that it is necessary to document, compare testimonies, distinguish memory from myth, and, above all, consider the well-being of the people involved. At the center of this process, our lives, and the responsibility of any analysis is to weigh the human impact before feeding narratives that may cause more harm than good. At the same time, there is an undeniable beauty in the possibility of transformation that the messages evoke. The idea that words, even whispered ones, can reorganize priorities and awaken practical advice for love and care is inspiring. It's as if revelation, even partial, offers clues for a new beginning. Small spiritual practices that translate into concrete actions, decisions that heal wounds, and a new sense of community that resists individualism. And here comes the question of timing. Some messages may await a moment when the emotional and pastoral infrastructure exists to welcome them, because a truth released without a support network can shatter as much as it liberates. This is the paradox behind the scenes: to reveal responsibly or to guard at risk, to expose and provoke panic or to protect and deprive. When one examines the map of these 7 signatures, the question that runs through everything is about authority and who has the mission to guide. Religious leaders, scholars, and witnesses play distinct roles, and how each interprets and acts upon the whispered words defines the direction. The complexity arises precisely because these voices are not always in sync. Disputes over interpretation can generate divisions, and the fabric of the community can be tested. Still, the strength of the messages lies in their power to touch the heart and summon public action that, well conducted, can transform realities. And it is this potential transformation, practical, emotional, and spiritual, that keeps the narrative alive and relevant. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic. I want you to feel the emotional map we're drawing, the colors of warning, regret, protection, and signs. Also feel the weight of the decisions that can arise from these words. Reflect, for a moment, on which of these signatures resonates most with you today. For that calls for vigilance, hope that sparks a new routine, or urgency that demands immediate choices. Write it down. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Starting with the first 2 messages, we immediately sense an urgent and intimate tone, a call to conversion and a first warning that seems to have a dual function: to awaken the heart and signal that something needs to change in everyday choices. These messages don't come as technical manuals. They arrive as invitations to an inner transformation that, if embraced, impacts attitudes, priorities, and even the simplest daily relationships. Think of conversion not as a grand, isolated gesture, but as a series of small, cumulative decisions: returning to regular prayers, setting aside face-to-face time to listen to family, giving up habits that erode domestic peace. The change requested is practical before theoretical. It is the decision to align one's mindset with actions that sustain a new lifestyle. And when a call touches in this way, the impact is not just spiritual. It changes routines, emotional, labor, and even the way a community organizes itself to care for its own. Now, imagine concrete signs that might indicate that these first messages are being fulfilled. I'm not talking about spectacles in the sky, but more subtle indicators: an increase in people seeking counseling, prayer groups multiplying, families beginning to reclaim the habit of eating together or asking for forgiveness, community leaders promoting reconciliation exercises, initiatives to care for the elderly and vulnerable gaining priority. These practical changes may go unnoticed by those expecting something merely grand, but when accumulated, they produce real transformation. What if the first warning had already begun to be fulfilled? The question begs, are we so busy that we ignore small revolutions happening around us? Could measuring the fulfillment of a message solely by extraordinary signs blind us to the silent work of everyday conversion? There's also an important psychological dimension to this dynamic. When a message calls for repentance, it touches on old wounds, memories that can provoke intense reactions. The process of change requires support counseling, community, practices that foster emotional stability. Without this support, urgency can turn into anxiety, and spiritual motivation can slip into the realm of unproductive guilt. Therefore, signaling concrete practices, daily prayers, sincere confession, acts of reparation is essential for the transformation to progress healthily. In other words, the desired conversion isn't just a change in discourse, but a redesign of habits that requires training, patience, and support networks. Another point to consider is the risk of extreme interpretations. Warning messages, when misread, can lead to impulsive decisions, radical job changes, family separations, and adherence to closed movements that promise simple answers to complex issues. This is where collective discernment and responsible leadership come in. Life decisions require careful consideration. Adopting practices suggested by a message without evaluating the concrete consequences can cause practical and psychological harm. Therefore, a balanced mindset combines openness to the call with analysis of the repercussions. What resources does the community have to embrace change? What are the real priorities? How can a spiritual impulse be transformed into a sustainable life project? In family relationships, conversion brings clear signs, greater presence, conversations that previously didn't happen, reconciliations that seemed impossible. It's often in this microcosm that the degree of adherence to a message is measured. A home that prays together again, that reorients priorities and protects moments of encounter, is responding in a practical way to the call. These small victories are often the quietest, but also the most lasting. And the social impact of this is great. Communities with stronger ties tend to respond better to crises, organize mutual aid, and resist polarization. Intimate transformation, therefore, generates public repercussions. However, we must also recognize the place of doubt and skepticism. Not everyone who hears messages feels the same appeal. For many, prudence is the healthiest stance. Questioning, investigating, and asking for evidence is not a sign of coldness, but of intellectual and ethical responsibility. Researchers who study spiritual phenomena warn of the need to document accounts, check temporal consistency, and consider cultural factors that shape memory. A lack of clear data can increase the feeling of hidden truth, and this same feeling can both protect and distort. The challenge, therefore, is to navigate between the faith that opens the heart and the vigilance that preserves intellectual honesty. That also means considering the journey of those who received the revelations. The weight of an unshared message can strain emotional health. The desire to report everything can lead to undue exposure. Imposed silence can damage trust. These human tensions require a compassionate approach, psychological support, safe spaces to share, and clear criteria for validating experiences. The impact of decisions to keep something hidden or make it public has concrete consequences, and any analysis must take this human cost into account. Furthermore, there's the issue of prophetic timing. Some spiritual traditions believe that certain revelations have a specific time to emerge. Thus, the prudence in postponing disclosure can be understood as respect for a larger time frame, an attempt to minimize harm and maximize good. On the other hand, there's the risk that the delay could be used to control narratives or manipulate. The tension between trust in the process and the demand for transparency is one of the most sensitive points in this story. When we think about messages 1 and 2, therefore, we see a clear invitation to transform our mindset and daily decisions. As we navigate a terrain that demands discernment, support, and responsibility, the transformation they call for is practical and relational, and the signs of its fulfillment can be both modest and powerful changes at dinner tables. Decisions about care, concrete steps to live with greater integrity. And if you look closely, many of these changes are invisible in the headlines, but they are the ones that, in the long run, change destinies. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject. I invite you to observe. What small decisions could you make today that, together, would be a real encounter with this calling? Comment, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic. When we talk about messages 3 and 4, we enter a zone where the visible and the intimate intertwine in an almost theatrical way. Public signs that present themselves as lights, as phenomena that easily become news, and the immediate echo of this in families who, in small or profound ways, experience a real impact. These messages, as described by those who report them, bring images that are at once symbolic and specific, a light that pierces the dawn, an alignment of events that many classify as a sign, or a collective sense that something extraordinary has happened. Is not just a show. It's a call that impacts routine, alters mindsets, and demands practical decisions. The transformation these lights provoke isn't just visible, it translates into behaviors, into choices fueled by a new sense of responsibility or protection. In the family sphere, the effect is notable. When the community perceives a sign that can be interpreted as confirming a message, families tend to react in ways that are simultaneously predictable and unpredictable. Some feel relief as if uncertainty has found a foothold, and others feel fear, a restlessness that demands quick responses. In many accounts, family protection appears as a central theme, practical instructions for caring for children, guidance on prayers at home, blessing practices passed down from generation to generation. These guidelines, when adopted with balance, can offer a new sense of security and acceptance. When adopted without support or reflection, they can provoke tension, withdrawal, and decisions motivated more by panic than conviction. I want to tell a short story that illustrates this dynamic. Well, it's anonymous, simple, and truthful in its tone. A small family, a father, mother, and a teenage son, lived near the village church. That night, when some residents saw a strange light in the sky, the father returned home more restless than usual. He had heard rumors during the day, and the image of that light had imprinted on his imagination. The next day, instead of reacting with panic, the mother suggested they sit at the table and talk honestly about their fears and priorities. They decided, by consensus, to begin praying together before meals and dedicating a weekly time to undistracted conversation, something that had disappeared between jobs and screens. The son, who had previously avoided these gatherings, eventually joined in and, little by little, recognized an emotional void that the conversations began to fill. Without grand public gestures, without proclamations, the family changed their habits. They began to support each other more, to manage their finances prudently, and to consider how to protect each other from real risks. For them, the sign in the sky was a trigger not of panic, but of a reevaluation of priorities, and their practical response was what converted a moment of uncertainty into a process of healing and reorganization. This is the positive side of impact, signs that act as catalysts for healthy change when support networks and common sense are in place. On the other hand, there's the opposite effect, where the same light, interpreted without criteria, can lead to impulsive decisions. Families that take extreme measures, isolate themselves, sell assets out of fear, or join closed groups that promise easy answers, end up creating new weaknesses. The same public revelation that can bring protection can also be used to manipulate, gain influence, or impose a dependency mentality. The hidden truth here is that the public signal is a mirror. It reflects what already exists in the community: trust, fear, lack of responsible leadership, and multiplies what it finds. Therefore, the practical impact on the family depends both on the content of the signal and on the health of the structures that should guide the response. At the community level, public signals alter dynamics. Churches, fear crowds, volunteers are mobilized, neighborhood conversations change subject matter. There's an emotional contagion effect that can be positive, creating a wave of solidarity, or negative, fueling rumors and polarization. Researchers who study collective phenomena draw attention to this point. Context matters more than we often imagine. A signal recognized as important by well-prepared leaders tends to generate organized initiatives, aid campaigns, structured prayer meetings, social support, while the same signal, misinterpreted, fuels panic and misinformation. The backstage of these reactions is made up of small decisions: who calls, who guides, who offers emotional support. Hence the importance of wise leadership, care networks, and protocols that prioritize the emotional and material well-being of families. It's also worth considering the symbolic dimension of signs. Lights in the sky, for example, are not just physical phenomena. They become metaphors that structure narratives. We're seeing light because something bigger is happening. This symbolic attribution is powerful. It changes mindsets, guides expectations, and can even redefine personal and community calendars. A community that interprets a sign as confirming a message can reorganize its practices around this. Expectation scheduling vigils, creating collective routines, and prioritizing solidarity projects. Here, the revelation moves from the extraordinary to the everyday, transforming habits and creating a new landscape of meaning. But there are practical challenges we cannot ignore. Family protection, when misguided, can turn into isolation. The search for signs can become obsession. The expectation of public revelations can weaken patience and deepen divisions. Therefore, the mindset that guides the response is crucial: a discerning stance, combining openness and criticism, tends to promote healthier decisions. Transformation without support peters out. Transformation anchored in community and support networks flourishes. Decisions that arise after a sign must be considered in terms of real impact, sustainability, and care for human vulnerabilities. Furthermore, the weight of hidden truth cannot be underestimated. When something is kept secret, the resulting vacuum tends to be filled by diverse narratives, some constructive, some destructive. The circulation of rumors can directly affect families who had nothing to do with the event, and the responsibility for mitigating this impact falls on those with the authority to provide sensitive guidance. In many cases, the difference between peace and disorder depends on how leaders communicate and support. The challenge, then, is to combine responsible transparency with pastoral care, so that public signals serve as instruments of healing rather than triggers of fragmentation. I want to delve even deeper into this topic, and while we reflect on signs and family protection, it's worth asking, when faced with a sign, what would be your immediate priority: protecting the emotional routine of your home, seeking information from reliable sources, or making room for practices that strengthen bonds? Comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic. Messages 5 and 6, as they circulate in the memories and accounts that have come down to us, are not just isolated words. They seem to draw a map of collective consequences and, at the same time, a roadmap for spiritual preparation. When we think about social impact, we need to imagine a ripple effect. Individual decisions reverberate through families. Families transform communities, and communities pressure institutions, churches, local leaders, and even civic structures to respond. The intimate conversion we saw in the first messages can evolve into community movements of solidarity, or, on the other hand, into divisions that fragment the social fabric. This is the central point. The same seed can generate a garden of care, or a weed of conflict, depending on the institutional and emotional soil in which it falls. Some experts, theologians, sociologists of religion, and scholars of collective phenomena often point out that the history of apparitions has recurring patterns. First comes the core group of witnesses who experienced the revelation. Then, dissemination throughout the community. Finally, institutionalization or rejection by recognized structures. At each stage, there are risks and opportunities. Can mean protection, organized support, and the creation of support networks. On the other hand, if poorly managed, it can crystallize rigid interpretations that exclude nuances and stifle dialogue. Spiritual preparation, therefore, is not just a set of devotional practices. It is also the building of community capacity to welcome, discern, and transform. It involves forming support councils, offering psychological counseling, structuring prayer groups that prioritize listening and care, and empowering leaders to interpret signs without generating hysteria. From a practical perspective, the collective consequences can take on concrete forms: increased demand for sacraments and guidance, reorganization of liturgical calendars, the emergence of welcoming initiatives for those seeking guidance, and even changes in the local economy, as pilgrimages and new influxes of visitors alter commerce and daily life. In more tense scenarios, polarization can occur. Aligning with one interpretation of the message can become a marker of identity, creating lines of we and unwe between neighbors and families. Sociability, therefore, undergoes fine-tuning, and the quality of this fine-tuning depends on the collective mindset and pastoral intelligence that takes hold behind the scenes. There's also a phenomenological risk. When the hidden truth begins to be perceived only in fragments, the social imagination tends to fill in the gaps with powerful narratives. These narratives can be of hope community projects, born from the impulse to serve, or of fear calls for drastic and urgent measures. What differentiates one path from the other is speed and support. A community that works with training and deliberate decisions can transform the initial impulse into sustainable processes. Another, without a support network, risks giving in to impulsive decisions that tear families apart and leave lasting wounds. The spiritual preparation suggested in these messages, when interpreted wisely, is a combination of personal practices and collective structures. On a personal level, we speak of the discipline of prayer, examination of conscience, practices of forgiveness, and small sacrifices that reinforce conversion. On a community level, it is necessary to invest in accessible spiritual education, family counseling, and service initiatives that serve the poor and vulnerable. Because faith that does not translate into practical care tends to be mere rhetoric. Some experts point out that preparing a community also involves thinking about emotional logistics. Where will people turn for help when fear grips them? Who offers financial support when families are impacted? How to maintain cohesion when there are differences of interpretation? These questions demand answers before the pressure of a signal creates ruptures. We cannot forget the political and cultural dimensions of this impact. In societies marked by inequality, a message calling for conversion and protection can be interpreted differently. For some, a call to solidarity. For others, a pretext to control behaviors and cultural roots. There is always the danger of instrumentalization. External agents, movements with their own agendas, or even local opportunists can use collective emotion to promote interests that have nothing to do with spiritual care. Therefore, responsible transparency and attention to the behind-the-scenes nature of decision-making are crucial. Participatory processes with diverse voices from the community reduce the chance of ideological capture and increase the likelihood that revelations will result in real well-being. Another layer to consider is psychological preparation. Profound transformation requires emotional support. The pressure of living proof of a future event can trigger anxiety, paranoia, or spiritual fatigue. To avoid this, psychological support programs integrated into pastoral actions are essential. Community psychologists, mental health workers trained to deal with religious phenomena, and care networks can act as a counterbalance to the risk of disorder. This is a pragmatic recommendation. The faith that heals is the one that combines with human knowledge to protect life and emotional health. And then arises the question that drives each reflection: what would it take to be ready? Preparation isn't just intense prayer. It's also training, structure, protocols, and a change of mindset that prioritizes the common good over personal narratives. It's thinking about decisions that preserve families, tools that promote dialogue between leaders and believers, communication channels that reduce noise and rumors, and networks that embrace vulnerabilities. It's, in short, aligning religious experience with social responsibility, transforming enthusiasm into concrete projects that care for people. When communities achieve this, the impact of the revelations tends to be positive. Assistance programs, cooperation between parishes, educational initiatives, and greater social resilience emerge. At the same time, we need humility. Not all consequences will be predictable, and not all preparation eliminates risks. The journey is complex, full of difficult decisions and continuous learning. What matters is the willingness to build structures of acceptance and discernment that prioritize life. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic and invite you to consider, what practical steps could your community take today to transform temporary excitement into real, sustainable change? Comment, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, and this is where the story shifts in tone. Message 7 appears in the narratives as that central stone that supports the entire arch, the key message that carries the weight of the others, that synthesizes warning, promise, and invitation in a single sentence, even if that sentence has been whispered, fragmented, or even sealed. Raising the tension is not a gimmick. It is recognizing that, when we reach this point, we are dealing with a hidden truth that no longer fits only in backroom conversations. It is a word that demands a response and provokes decisions small and large in the lives of those who receive it and those around them. We can interpret this message as a final warning, something that demands vigilance and urgent change. We can see it as a promise of hope for those who choose to respond faithfully, or as a radical invitation to fidelity, which tests priorities and reshapes trajectories. In either reading, the question that emerges is direct and personal. Would you be willing to change something in your life because of this? Consider the practical implications of this question. It's not just a symbolic gesture, it's about reorienting mindsets, making decisions that impact routines, relationships, and responsibilities. Real transformation often comes in humble packages: deciding to forgive, breaking a habit that erodes coexistence, setting aside time for silence and prayer, assuming old responsibilities that had been neglected. The key message works like a mirror. It restores to the listener the weight of choices and the possibility of concrete change. For some, this will mean minimal adjustments that reverberate, a table that becomes a place for dialogue again, a priority shifting from work to caring for family, a gesture of reparation that breaks a cycle of hurt. For others, it may require greater sacrifices, and then the equation becomes more complex. What is the cost of obeying a call that seems to demand total transformation? Where is the line between courage and recklessness? Possible interpretations range from hope to anxiety. Some read Message 7 as a promise of protection for those who embrace change, a kind of safe haven for those who decide to move in the indicated direction. From this perspective, the message is not a punishment, but an invitation to restoration, choices that rebuild, practices that heal, a journey back to the essential. On the other hand, there are readings in which the message sounds like a stern appeal, a final warning demanding readiness. In these readings, urgency accelerates decisions, and the collective mindset can oscillate between prudent vigilance and misguided panic. The impact of each reading depends largely on the context, the leaders who welcome and guide, the available support networks, the local culture, and the psychological predispositions of the people involved. In practical terms, the implications are multiple. If the message is taken as a final warning, communities can define protection protocols, prioritize vulnerable groups, reorganize resources, and plan coordinated responses. If it is taken as a promise, it can generate initiatives of practical hope, social projects, support for those suffering, and educational programs that solidify the desired transformation. If it is read as an invitation to fidelity, the focus tends to be ethical and relational, making long-term commitments, reconfiguring relationships, and accepting the discipline of a life committed to a higher value. Each path demands different decisions, and each decision has immediate and long-term consequences. There is also a realm of tension that we cannot ignore. Hidden truth, when partially revealed, gives rise to contradictory interpretations and the risk of exploitation. Leaders with personal agendas or groups seeking power may attempt to capitalize on the mystery, thus transforming a spiritual calling into a tool of control. Therefore, the question about personal willingness, would you be willing to change something in your life because of this, is not just rhetoric. It is an ethical line that separates authentic commitment from manipulable emotional reaction. Choosing to change requires responsibility, weighing the consequences, seeking advice, developing discernment, and building networks of care so that transformation does not turn into self-destruction. Furthermore, the psychological implications are profound. Receiving a key message can trigger crises of meaning, internal conflicts, and challenges to identity. The listener's journey may include periods of doubt, loneliness, and even moral persecution within circles that do not understand. The change, emotional preparation, and community support, then, become essential ingredients to ensure that conversion is not merely a passing impulse. Mental health professionals, compassionate leaders, and present friends play a decisive role in sustaining the transformative process. Transformation without support networks tends to be fragile. Transformation anchored in human care has a chance to last and produce social benefits. There's also the element of time and prophetic timing. Some say that certain words are only revealed at the right time, and that to anticipate them would compromise their effect. This view brings up debates about responsibility and timing, about who decides the timing of revelations. Others argue that transparency saves lives and that protecting essential information indefinitely is a form of power that can be abusive. Between these poles, society needs to find a balance that prioritizes the common good and human dignity. Message 7, being the most weighty, concentrates this tension. Its handling requires wisdom, humility, and a willingness to prioritize life over spectacular narratives. Returning to the personal realm, the question remains incisive. What small changes would you accept today, without dramatizing, but with seriousness? Perhaps it's limiting your use of social media to regain time for yourself. Perhaps it's asking someone for forgiveness. Perhaps it's starting to cultivate simple rituals of prayer and silence that restore inner balance. These decisions, when combined, form a new mindsetting. It is this shift in mindset that, for many, represents true conversion. Impact, then, is measured not in grand events, but in consistency, a routine that supports faith, relationships that heal, decisions that begin to be made with more prudence and compassion. At the collective level, imagining the implications of Message 7 also means imagining policies of care, institutions that offer material and emotional support, networks that facilitate dialogue without polarization, leadership practices that prioritize listening. Before deciding, when these conditions exist, the potential of a revelation translates into positive social transformation. When they are lacking, the same revelation can escalate tensions and deepen wounds. This is why the words of theologians and scholars, even presented as some experts say, become a valuable resource, not to replace faith, but to guide decisions with an informed and human perspective. The truth is that Message 7, whether read as a warning, a promise, or a call to fidelity, places the question of responsibility. At the center, it's not just about believing. It's about acting with discernment, taking risks with practical changes when necessary, and, above all, caring for one another along the journey. Ask yourself again, would you be willing to change something in your life because of this? Keep this question as a compass as we continue exploring the more concrete implications and the voices surrounding this message. Comment below. I'm on this journey to now. I want to delve even deeper into this topic. As we weave together everything we've seen, signs, testimonies, silence, and authority, we need to land on something practical and accessible, without losing the emotional dimension and respect for the lives involved. The 7 messages are an invitation to change, but also a mystery that demands discernment. They call us to personal and communal transformation, and at the same time remind us that not every truth needs to be displayed to be powerful. Some truths are guarded by prudence, by protection, by a timing that only reveals itself with maturity. That said, it's helpful to translate this conclusion into a simple guide to action. Concrete steps that anyone can begin practicing now, without spectacle, but with purpose. First, daily silence. I'm not talking about performative silence, but about an intentional space of a few minutes a day in which one tunes out the noise of the networks, breathes attentively, and listens to one's own life. Silence creates a climate for awareness. It reveals hidden priorities, reveals small emotional fissures, and allows one to distinguish what is urgent from what is merely noise. Second, prayer with presence. Prayer here doesn't need complex liturgy. It can be a brief and sincere practice, words that guide, requests for wisdom and gratitude that rebuild the mindset. Having a prayer routine strengthens the inner core. It helps one make decisions with less haste and more compassion. Third, reading that seeking out reading material that nourishes discernment, texts that speak of mature spirituality, stories of transformation, and practical guides on coexistence expands one's vision and prevents the imagination from filling in gaps with dangerous theories. Fourth, family dialogue. Setting aside time to talk without cell phones, to listen without judgment, and to share fears and hopes. Concrete change usually arises at home tables where listening and reparation are practiced. These steps are small on the outside, enormous on the inside. They don't promise spectacle, but they offer sustainable transformation. In other words, they work on the ground of everyday decisions that, when aggregated, generate real impact. And there are complementary practices that deserve attention. Seeking out serious communities that practice welcoming, seeking counsel from leaders who value human life more than sensational narratives, and seeking psychological support when experiences stir deep emotions. Transformation without a support network tends to be fragile. transformation anchored in human care lasts. By rethinking the entire journey from the hill and its lights, through the 7 emotional signatures, to the place of authority and controversy, a logic of responsibility emerges. What is revealed requires careful reception. If a message proposes change, it also demands that decisions be accompanied by practical structures that protect families and communities. That's why it's so important that the question, would you be willing to change something in your life because of this, be answered with a simple plan. What changes are possible today? What family resources exist to support them? Who can help, guide, and how to measure the impact of these choices in the short and long term? But this brings us to a larger and real problem. How to balance a zeal for truth with the need to act quickly when people's lives are at stake? The answer isn't easy, because it involves ethics, hermeneutics, and institutional humility. Some experts argue that it's better to prevent panic with controlled silence. Others emphasize that transparency saves lives and preserves community trust. In practical terms, achieving balance requires protocols that include responsible communication, emotional support, and clear criteria for dissemination. This is part of the necessary behind-the-scenes work. It's not enough to have a transformative message. It's necessary to ensure that its implementation doesn't break the fragile bonds that sustain social life. And it is at this point that collective thinking proves decisive. A culture that prioritizes listening, education, and service tends to convert signals into beneficial actions. A culture of spectacle tends to amplify risks. Decisions about rituals, community prayers, and protective practices must always be aligned with social care policies, programs that serve the vulnerable, educational initiatives that combat misinformation, and structures that welcome those who are vulnerable. In other words, faith and social responsibility go hand in hand. When the intention is truly the common good, another element that frequently appears behind the scenes is the role of leadership. Leaders who assume ethical responsibility can mediate tensions and transform fervor into practical service. When leadership becomes closed off, the risk of manipulation increases. When it acts with responsible transparency, the potential for transformation increases. The required change in mindset is also an invitation to institutional maturity. Organizations that learn to listen, document, and protect are those that generate less harm and more fruit. On a personal level, decisions invariably involve sacrifices and adjustments. Perhaps it's limiting activities that rob us of presence and prioritizing relationships. Perhaps it's dedicating time to restoring broken bonds or committing to caring for someone in vulnerability. These choices don't happen in a vacuum. They are small, everyday moral revolutions that, when combined, produce genuine impact. The journey is slow, requires repetition, and demands patience, but it is also deeply rewarding when it translates into lives that find meaning again. And if we return to the point of controversies and testimonies, we will see that active discernment is an attitude that combines openness and criticism's the most valuable tool. Listening to emotional accounts, considering expert analyses, and using clear criteria for verification are not attitudes opposed to faith. They are, in fact, ways of loving the truth and caring for people. This balance transforms the search for revelation into a healthy community practice, capable of transforming fear into care and curiosity into responsible action. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic and propose a practical exercise for you for 3 days. Try creating a small ritual: 5 minutes of silence in the morning, a short reading that nourishes your discernment, a sincere conversation in the evening with someone in your home, and a concrete act of caring. Notice that changes happen in small gestures. The big question that runs through this whole story isn't proving or disproving miracles. It's how to translate a potential revelation into decisions that preserve life, promote healing, and strengthen community. Comment: this makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking with me through this conversation. Means this topic touched you in some way. If you found it useful and want to see more thoughtful analyses like this, subscribe to the channel. It's the simplest way to say you want me to continue bringing you in-depth, researched, and thoughtful content. Leave a like, twits, not just a number. It's a sign of connection, that this narrative resonated with someone on the other side of the screen. Write the phrase, "I'm with you until the end," in the comments, so I know you've made it this far and want to continue this journey together. I'll read and respond to some comments. There's a video here that complements this topic. Click and stay with me there so we can delve even deeper into these revelations and what they might mean in practice. Thank you for your attention, and see you soon in the next video.